Welcome to Penetration Testing, Incident Response, and Forensics, brought to you by IBM. In this series, we'll be focusing on incident response. In this series, we'll be covering what an incident response is, as well as the different phases that makes up an incident response. Those phases are preparation, detection and analysis, containment, eradication, and recovery, and the post-incident activity. Each of these will be their own little sections. We'll then cover some root cause analysis, and we'll wrap up this series with a demo on incident response. Welcome to What is Incident Response, brought to you by IBM. In this video, we'll be covering what an incident response is and why they're important. We'll also be discussing the difference between an event and an incident and taking a high-level look at the different phases of an incident response. We'll wrap things up by talking about the different types of incident response teams and the different teams they need to coordinate with. Let's get started. Before we can define what an incident response is, we need to distinguish between an event and an incident. An event can be something as benign and unremarkable as typing on a keyboard or receiving an email. A lot of times these unassuming events, though, taken in context, can lead to an incident. So for instance, a keystroke or a login or an email is not a big deal, but if there were multiple tens, hundreds of these events within a small time frame, that would cause some red flags. These red flags are picked up in intrusion detection systems or IDS software. That alert that they pick up can be considered an event until it's validated by the incident response team, at which point it becomes an incident. So now we know that an incident is an event that has become a threat. It's something that negatively affects the IT systems and impacts the business. It's an unplanned interruption or reduction in quality of IT services. So we know an event can become an incident, but not the other way around. So now that we know the difference between an event and how it could become an incident, let's go ahead and define incident response. Preventative activities based on the results of risk assessments can lower the number of incidents, but not all incidences can be prevented. An incident response is therefore necessary for rapidly detecting incidents, minimizing their loss and destruction, mitigating the weaknesses that were exploited, and restoring IT services. So we know what an incident is, and we know that we need to respond to these incidents, but why? So the benefits of having incident response is that it supports responding to incidents systematically so that appropriate actions are taken. It helps personnel to minimize loss or theft of information and disruption of services caused. And ultimately, you can use the information gained in the incident handling to better prepare for any future incidents. Let's talk a little bit about the types of incident response teams that exist. Now, there are many roles within an incident response team, but again, this is just a general overview. So teams can be coordinated in one of three ways. There's the central incident response team, which really think of it like a small company where all of its resources are centralized to one area. You would have a single incident response team for the entire organization. Now that, as opposed to a distributed incident response team, think of a very large company who may have its technical resources and computing power distributed globally. So you might have an incident response team per geographic location or per country, per site, depending on where the computing power is really centralized. Now, even though they would be distributed amongst these different sites, countries, locations, it's important that they stay coordinated in their efforts because what one team finds is going to benefit another team. So it's still all the same team, just across a lot of different areas. Lastly, we have the coordinating team, and this one we're not going to dive in really too much, but really you can think of it as an incident response team providing advice to other teams that they don't have any authority over. For example, a department-wide team may assist individual agencies' teams. And so that's really what we're looking at here. We're looking at, are these teams together supporting the entire organization, Are the teams distributed across multiples, or are we assisting, other teams in their efforts? So you can think about incident response teams in that way. Incident response doesn't operate within a vacuum. Each individual incident or threat may and likely will impact other areas of the organization. Those individuals you will need to create working relationships with. That way, in case they need to participate in the incident handling, you can have their cooperation beforehand as opposed to trying to seek it afterwards. Listed here are some of the general areas that you should be seeking out to make those relationships with. First and foremost, management. So management establishes the incident response policy in general and are held responsible for coordinating the incident response and report to all the various stakeholders. So that should be one of the first things that you engage. Information assurance. So the information security staff members may be needed during certain stages of incident handling. If they have to alter any network security controls, any firewall rule sets, things like that. IT support will likely be involved. Not only do they have the needed skills to assist, but usually have a better understanding of the technology they manage on a daily basis. This can come in handy, for instance, if we need to take appropriate actions with the affected system, like whether or not they can disconnect it or reboot or image or whatever they have to do. The legal department, legal experts should review the incident response plan, policies, and procedures to ensure their compliance with the law and federal guidance, including the right to privacy. So if there was a threat or an incident that involved sensitive personal information, legal department will likely need to be involved there. Likewise, public affairs and media relations. So given the nature of the impact of the incident, you may need to, engage the media, or if it got leaked out to the media, you need somebody to help coordinate for that. Human resources. If an employee was involved, either an employee's information or if they were involved in the actual causation of an incident, they'll need to be engaged to help facilitate that. Business continuity planning. Really, you can think of this like each business has so much going on, and an incident could impact all those different areas of business. So you need to rope in whoever is the business continuity planning manager or whoever's in charge of the day-to-day operations, so that they can understand how their services may or may not be impacted. And finally, physical security and facilities management. So some incidents can occur through physical breaches of security and involve physical attacks. So the incident response team may need to access those facilities. So establishing a relationship with those teams will be important. While an organization may not be able to prepare for every single case scenario of a cybersecurity incident, they should be able to handle the common vectors that attacks can come from. So for instance, if there's an external removable media, so this is if a flash drive or external hard drive or CD becomes present in the network or in the system that isn't authorized or is unfamiliar, we should be able to pick up on that. If there is an attrition attack, something like brute force password hacking, that's something we should be able to pick up on. We should be able to detect any threats coming from the web, coming from email, an impersonation attack. So if an event happens under the guise of being from somebody else and they alter the information and pass it on, kind of like a man-in-the-middle attack, that's a big deal. Also, just the loss and theft of physical equipment is something that we need to have inventory of and audit regularly. So these are the different common attack vectors. This isn't an exhaustive list, but these are things that we need to be prepared to handle. We'll be getting into all the things that you'll eventually need to document for an incident response. But as a high-level overview, you'll need to be able to answer these questions. These are framed more like, if we had to talk to the media right now, what do we know? So that's our filter. We need to know who attacked us, why, when did it happen, how did it happen? Did this process happen because we have poor security processes? How widespread is it? What steps are we taking to determine what happens what happened and to prevent future occurrences. What is the impact of the incident? Was any personally identifiable information exposed for the company, its employees, or their customers? And what was the estimated cost of this? So these are just general guidelines to fact check yourself, saying, do we have the baseline information before we proceed? The last thing I want to discuss in this video is actually what's going to launch us through the rest of this video series. What are the phases of an incident response? We're going to be taking you through the preparation, detection and analysis, containment, eradication and recovery, and then any post-incident activity. We're going to kick off the next video with preparation. Let's get started. Welcome to Incident Response Preparation, brought to you by IBM. In this video, we'll be learning about incident response policies. We'll then review the resources needed for an incident response teams to be successful. We'll learn about the recommended practices for securing networks, systems, and applications, and we'll end with a preparation checklist. Let's get started. Every successful incident response team will have a policy in place that helps decide who, what, when, where, why, and how an incident will be responded to. Here are some of the things that the policy will need to cover. It'll need to cover who the incident response team is within the organization, as well as the different roles of the incident response team. So this will help determine the scope of support for each person in the team. It'll cover the means, tools, and resources that will be used to identify and recover compromised data. It'll cover policy testing, which is really important given the ever-evolving landscape of threats in the cybersecurity world. And it'll also cover just an action plan, so an actual detailed outline of how we execute this plan from start to finish. Next, let's expand on the resources that I mentioned in the policy. We can really break down resources into three categories, the first of which is the incident handler communications and facilities. So we need to know all the contact information of all of the personnel on our team, as well as the off-hours on-call information. So if something happens, what's the chain of command? Do I have my manager's number? Do I have the on-calls person's number, my manager's manager? You got to know all that information because time is one of the most important factors in incident response. You'll need to know what your incident reporting mechanisms are and have them in place. So what software you're using, what databases, ticketing systems, so on and so forth. Smartphones, we mentioned, having people on call. Does everybody have a company issued cell phone that they can have with them at all times in case an incident occurs? What encryption software are we using to be able to encrypt the data that we recover or clone or what have you? Do we have a centralized place like a war room where all the parties can get together and actually communicate in the same room? Do we have a secure storage facility for any assets that are recovered? The next category is the hardware or software that we're using. So do we have the digital forensic workstations and such or backup devices ready? Does everybody have a laptop, backup laptops, spare workstation servers, networking equipment, or the virtual machine equivalents of those? Do we have blank removable media, external hard drives, CDs, flash drives? Do we have a portable printer to print out any logs or evidence that we need? Do we have packet sniffers, protocol analyzers, so that if it was a web attack, we can monitor the network and find out sources of where they're coming from or general information like that? And then what evidence gathering accessories are you going to need from there? The last category is going to be for the incident analysis itself. Do you have a list of all the ports? Do you have the proper documentation to go through? Do you have a network diagram that lists all the critical assets that you have? What are the current baselines of the network and the organization? If you have services, software, things like that. Do you know the baseline so you can check them against, what's happening now in the aftermath to compare and contrast? And do you have the cryptographic hashes? So these are not a comprehensive list, but this is a really good idea to understand just how many things can go into an incident response. Incident response teams have a lot on their plates, and one of the best ways they can manage their workload is to help prevent incoming incidences as best as they can. Usually this is out of scope for incident response team to create the prevention of events that turn into incidents, but it's something that they can help advise on, and it's worth mentioning, right? So keeping the number of incidents reasonably low is really important to protect the business process of the organization in general. If security controls are insufficient, higher volumes of incidences occur, overwhelming the incident response team. So the best offense really is a good defense. So some of the things that incident response teams can help provide advice on, or just communicate to other people in the organization that we need to shore up. Risk assessment has to be on point. So periodic risk assessments of systems and apps should determine what risks are posed by combinations of threats and vulnerabilities. Host and network security. So all hosts should be hardened appropriately using standard configurations, adhere to strict ACLs, and be monitored continuously. For the network perimeter should be configured to deny all activity that is not expressly permitted, right? That's just basically network security. You're looking at malware prevention, so you'll need a good software to detect and stop malware, and should be deployed throughout the entire organization, having that endpoint security. And then user awareness and training. So users should be made aware of different policies and procedures, especially if they've changed, regarding to the use of networks, systems, and applications. So again, this isn't necessarily the strict job of an incident response team. However, having these shored up and making sure that all personnel involved and employees are trained really helps reduce the number of incidences, which then increases the response rate of the incident response team. The last thing I'll leave you with preparation was provided by the SANS Institute, which is just a great checklist. Are all members aware of the security policies in the organization? Do all members of the computer incident response team know who to contact? Do all incident responders have access to journals and access to incident response toolkits to perform the actual incident response process? And have all members participated in the incident response drills to practice the incident response process and to improve the overall proficiency on a regular established basis? So that's what we have for preparation. Let's go ahead and move on to detection and analysis. Welcome to Incident Response Detection and Analysis, brought to you by IBM. In this video, we're going to learn the differences between a precursor and an indicator and their common sources. We'll also discuss the different types of monitoring systems used for detection. We'll then learn about the importance of prioritization and documentation, and we'll end with reviewing the possible communication channels needed after detection. Let's get started. The first thing we need to break down in detection is really the precursors and the indicators. So a precursor is a sign that an incident may occur in the future. So you get a heads up as to something that's going to happen, whereas an indicator is a sign that something may have already occurred or is occurring now. It's something you would notice in the present and say, wow, something's either happening or has happened. Examples of a precursor could be web server log entries that show the usage of a vulnerability scanner. So you say, hey, somebody's using a vulnerability scanner against us. Something's going to happen. There could be an announcement of a new exploit that targets a vulnerability of an organization's mail server, or it could be as bold as a threat from a group stating that said group will attack the organization. Now, precursors are much less common. As much as we would love a heads up for every time, an incident was going to happen, most things are actual indicators that we notice. Things like antivirus software alerts when it detects that a host is infected with malware, a system administrator sees a file name with unusual characters, a host records an auditing configuration change in its log, an application logs multiple failed login attempts from an unfamiliar remote system. Clearly somebody's trying to get in. An email administrator sees a large number of bounced emails with suspicious content. Even a network administrator noticing an unusual deviation from typical network traffic flows. So this is the difference between precursor and an indicator, something that is going to happen versus something is or has already happened. Now, let's take a second to go over some common sources. I know I provided you some examples, but let's go over common sources of a precursor and an indicator. Sources can range anywhere from alerts, logs, publicly available information, and people. Things like alerts from intrusion detection or prevention software, the security information event management software, antivirus, anti-spam software, file integrity checking software, third-party monitoring services, and we'll be going into different monitoring types of monitoring software in just a little bit, but know that they're a major source of our indicators. The logs, they can be from the operating system, service and application logs, network device logs, or the network flow. Publicly available information, this is things that we find on news or maybe the National Vulnerability Database. For people, I mean, these could be people inside the organization saying, hey, something's happening. I've noticed something that's happening, and it's our due diligence to check in that. It could be from other organizations. For example, it could be coming from support. It could be coming from, maybe somebody's web page is being attacked and we have to, deal with that. So these are all different sources of precursors and indicators that come through. Now, I'd mentioned, some of the alerts come from intrusion detection and prevention software and monitoring. I want to kind of break down the differences between the different types of monitoring softwares. There are quite a few different types of monitoring systems, and each of them are crucial for early detection. Now, all of these aren't mutually exclusive, and they all do still require an incident response team to document and analyze the data. So the first type of monitoring software are going to be IDS and IPS software. So that's intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems. So both are part of the network infrastructure. The main difference between them is that IDS is a monitoring system that just gathers the information, whereas IPS is a control system, so it will actively filter out any packets that don't comply with the security policy. So one just monitors and the other one actually performs action for preventing threats from happening. Now, DLP, the data loss prevention, is a set of tools and processes used to ensure that sensitive data is not lost, misused, or accessed by unauthorized users. Especially, this really helps when data is being stored, moved, actively accessed, things like that. So all of this detection is around data. Now, the security information event management solution combines security event management, which carries out the analysis of event and log data in real time, with security information management. So it's kind of a holistic view that deals with the log files directly to create an event or an alert of some sort. So this, again, is not all of the systems out there. These are just the broad categories that incident response teams can use. The next thing that we're going to be talking about is hugely, hugely important, both in incident response and many other areas of cybersecurity, which is documentation. Now, regardless of the monitoring system that you're using, a thoroughly documented ticket is going to help not only the current event and incident, but all future ones that may occur. So common things that we are going to need to capture: the current status of the incident. Did it already happen? Is it ongoing? Is it something that we know is going to happen? Give me a summary. What's happening? How did it happen? What do we know so far? Any indicators related to the incident? How did we find out about it? What tipped us off? Other incidents related to this incident. So was this isolated? Was this in a series of incidents? Things like that. Actions taken by all incident handlers on this. So a big, basically an audit log of everybody who has touched it up to this point, and then up into like a chain of custody if possible. So chain of custody is a thoroughly documented, almost like keeping minutes of who's touched this for how long, who's on it now, so that since the incident actually happened, you can record who's been touching it, who's has eyes on it, things like that. You'll need to know the impact assessment related to the incident. And we're going to be talking about, prioritizing impacts here in a minute, but you'll need to document, like, is this a big deal or not? We'll need to know the contact information for any involved parties. We'll need a list of evidence gathered during the incident investigation. We'll need comments from all the incident handlers, and then obviously next steps to be taken. Now, before we can take proper next steps, we need to be able to prioritize what the impacts are. And so let's talk about what some of those are. So the first category of impacts is going to be the functional impacts of the incident. Now, this is taken directly from the National Institute of Security and Technology. So when we look at these, we see there could be no impact, right? So if there's no effect to the organization's ability to provide services to all of its users. There's the low impact, so there's just a minimal effect. Organization can still provide all critical services to some users, but has lost efficiency. It's just not as good. The medium impact is it's lost some service to a subset of users. And a high impact is we have completely lost the ability to provide any services to any users. So we go from none all the way to high for the functional impact. The next area of impact is going to be on the information. So if there's no impact for the information, none was exfiltrated, changed, deleted, or otherwise compromised. If there was a privacy breach, sensitive personally identifiable information, PII, of taxpayers, employees, beneficiaries, etc., was accessed and exfiltrated. A proprietary breach is unclassified proprietary information, such as protected critical infrastructure information that was accessed or infiltrated. And then there's the integrity loss. So sensitive or proprietary information was changed or deleted. So this isn't necessarily a scale of like none to high, but these are the different types of categories of informational impact that can exist. And the last category of impacts is going to be the ability to recover from. So if this is just a regular recoverability effort, it's, the time to recover is predictable with our existing resources, saying, yes, it'll take this long with this many people, we got it covered. Supplemented, so time to recover is predictable, but we're going to need some more help to get this done. Extended is the time to recover is unpredictable. We're not sure how long it's going to take to resolve this issue, and we are going to need outside people to help. And then there's just the non-recoverable. So recovery from this is not possible. So think of sensitive data was exfiltrated and posted publicly, and we need to launch an investigation. Now that we've thoroughly documented the incident and determined what the impact is going to be on the organization, we need to alert everybody that is or could be involved. So this includes but not limited to the chief information officer, local and head of information security, other incident response teams within the organization if there are different sites or countries, external incident response teams if appropriate. Who's the system owner? Do I need to involve HR, public affairs if this gets out in the media, legal department, and law enforcement even if possible? So a big part of incident response team is the coordination that happens. And we talked in the first video of being able to establish those relationships with other teams within the organization and outside. And this is why, because now that we know the severity of the situation, we can alert all parties involved or that need to be involved to get the ball rolling on a resolution. And that wraps up detection and analysis. In our next video, we're going to begin containment, eradication, and recovery. See you there. Welcome to Incident Response, Containment, Eradication, and Recovery, brought to you by IBM. In this video, we'll learn what to take into consideration when selecting a containment strategy. We'll also learn why backup and forensics are a part of the containment process. We'll then review the goals of eradication and recovery, and then we'll review the SANS checklist for this section. Let's get started. Containment is important before an incident overwhelms resources or increases in damage. Containment strategies vary based on the type of incident. For example, the strategy for containing an email-borne malware infection is quite different than that of a network-based DDoS attack. The whole point of containment is to be able to stop the threat and mitigate any further damage. In order to do this, you need incredible decision making. And such decisions are easier to make if there are predetermined strategies and procedures for containing the incident. The National Institute for Standards and Technology breaks down the different things to take into consideration when choosing a containment strategy. You'll need to look at what the potential damage to and theft of resources is. You'll need to take a look at, is there a need for evidence preservation? Service availability. So if the threat impacted a service, how quickly do you need to be back up? Or is that, an important factor for you? The time and resources needed to implement the strategy. Do you need to coordinate between other teams? Do you have those resources available? And then how long is it going to take to execute? And then the effectiveness. So yes, I can execute, but is this going to resolve the issue? Is this just a Band-Aid? How much work are we going to put in knowing that it may or may not fully resolve the issue? And then what the duration of the solution is. So is this a quick fix to say, hey, I can do something right now to stop, the threat from further progressing, but we'll need to maybe look at something over the next couple weeks, months, something like that. Now, I did mention the need for preserving evidence. This happens with forensics. Now, evidence should be collected according to procedures that meet all applicable laws and regulations that have been deployed from previous discussions with legal staff and appropriate law enforcement agencies so that any evidence can be admissible in court. In order to do this, some things have to happen right away. First and foremost, you need to capture a backup image of the system as is before any changes are made to it. So before everybody gets their hands on it, you need to make a clone of it and only work off of that clone so that the original is not tampered with. Second, you gather evidence from that image that you captured. You can import that into an environment and explore what happened from there. Last and most important is following the chain of custody protocols. This means that information is going to change from hand to hand. So you need to carefully document who has access to the evidence, who accessed it and when, and if it moved, where it moved to, when it moved to, how it's being secured. So at any given time, there should be a paper trail documenting exactly what has happened to the evidence since it was captured. Now we'll go into this in much further detail in the next lesson, which is going to be all about forensics. But for now, know that it does serve a crucial role. We now look to eradication and recovery. NIST summarizes these as, after an incident's been contained, eradication may be necessary to eliminate components of the incident, such as deleting malware, disabling breached user accounts, as well as identifying and mitigating all vulnerabilities that were exploited. In other words, we're really looking to say, I've detected something that exists, I have stopped it with containment, and now I need to get rid of it. How do I get rid of everything that this touched? And so this can include everything from re-imaging, shutting down access to things, disabling services. There's a lot of different things that can go into how do I just purge everything that the threat touched. And given the extent of that is going to play into how the recovery goes. So recovery may involve such actions as restoring systems from clean backups, rebuilding systems from scratch, replacing compromised files with clean versions, installing patches, changing passwords, tightening the network perimeter, such as the firewall rule sets, boundary router access control lists, etc. So all of this, I would love to go into further detail, but all of it's going to change based on the systems, based on the incident that it occurred. And there's so many different variations. It's kind of out of scope of this specific presentation, but know that eradication and recovery will often go hand in hand, and that it's rarely the same twice. Now, regardless of what happens, a high level of testing and monitoring are often deployed to ensure the restored systems no longer are impacted by the incident. This could take weeks, this could take months, depending on how long it took to bring back the compromised systems into production. It's often done in phases just to make sure they can closely monitor and ensure that everything is back up and running. The last thing I want to touch on is the checklist from SANS Institute, which breaks down a series of questions from containment, eradication, and recovery. So for containment, can the problem be isolated? Are all affected systems isolated from non-affected systems? And have forensics copies of affected systems been created for further analysis? And if the answer to any of these is no, you need to dig deeper as to why. For eradication, is it possible? Can the system be re-imaged and then hardened with patches and or other countermeasures to prevent or reduce the risk of attacks? Have all malware and other artifacts left behind by the attackers been removed and the affected systems hardened against further attacks? And for recovery, what tools are you going to use to test, monitor, and verify that the systems being restored to production are not compromised by the same methods that caused the original incident? Welcome to Incident Response Post-Incident Activities, brought to you by IBM. In this video, we'll be covering the post-incident activities. For the most part, this includes the lesson learned review and meetings. There will be some other situational activities that we'll cover as well. Let's get started. The National Institute of Standards and Technology says that holding a lessons learned meeting with all involved parties after a major incident and optionally periodically after a lesser incidences as resources permit can be extremely helpful in improving security measures and the incident handling process itself. Lessons learned ultimately is a retrospective that takes a look at what could have been done better to iterate on in the future. Some of the hard-hitting questions that you need to ask are exactly what happened, at what times, how well did staff and management perform in dealing with the incident, were the documented procedures followed? Were they adequate? So if they were followed, were there still gaps where we need to address that in the documentation? What information was needed sooner? So as we were going through either containment, eradication, or recovery, if we would have had some information sooner, could we have expedited the process? Were any steps or actions taken that might have inhibited the recovery? What would the staff and management do differently the next time a similar incident occurs? So it's one thing to not be prepared or to feel like you could have done better with an incident, but if the same incident occurs again, there should be marked improvement on that. How could information sharing with other organizations have been improved? So were there people you couldn't get a hold of or needed to collaborate with that could have been handled more efficiently, effectively, or in a more timely manner? What corrective actions can prevent similar incidents in the future? And what precursors or indicators could be watched for in the future to detect similar events? Now, these are just general questions that we can ask, but you'll need to ask specific questions given the major incident, or if there were trending issues across a bunch of smaller incidences, here's where you would flesh that out. Again, a key here is also documentation, taking anything that you find or discover and looping it back into the documentation so that the next time this occurs, we can all be ready. Outside of lessons learned, there are a few different activities that can take place based on the situation. A pretty universal one is utilizing the data that you've collected. So there are a lot of different things you can collect data on. Everything from your response times to the data that was impacted to how long it took to resolution, how long it took to recover. Every single step that you take can be measured. And in this, you need to decide which metric points are going to be most valuable for your organization and take a look at those to see the trends over time given similar incidences. Another thing worth mentioning is evidence retention. So in all the information that you've gathered and all the forensics that you ran, these will need to be stored, archived, and taken care of in a way that they could be used in the court of law at any given time. We talked a bit about using the chain of custody to make sure that everything is properly documented on when and how the evidence is being handled, but evidence retention does need to be in the plan. This is also a great time to revisit your documentation throughout the entire process. This goes everything from the incident response policy that you have drafted and put together, your incident handling documentation, your ticketing, your chain of custody. All of it is documentation throughout the entire process. If there are any gaps identified, now would be the time to address them. Welcome to a demo of incident response, brought to you by IBM. In this 3-part video, we'll be following along with Tommy Patton, who's taking us through a brief review of incident response. He'll then take us through his QRadar incident response queue to show us examples of incident response and how he documents each case. I ask that you pay close attention to the details he brings up and the questions he asks along the way. With that, we'll turn it over to Tommy.
My name is Tommy Patton. I've been in the cybersecurity field for about 5 years. I've worked with many different security tools and responded to countless security threats, many of them triggering incident response. Before defining incident response, we must first know the security threats we are faced with on a day-to-day basis. Some of the most common security threats are software attacks, data exfiltration, information sabotage, and even theft of equipment. Now that we have identified common security threats to an organization, we will identify the different attack vectors a hacker may take to gain control of a system or network. One example of an attack vector is a website hosting malicious content, waiting for a vulnerable user or browser to exploit. Thankfully, many modern-day security tools such as IBM QRadar, McAfee ePolicy Orchestrator, next-generation firewalls, and countless others are available for us to use. QRadar is a System Information Event Management Tool, for short, SIEM. In the simplest terms, QRadar is a log collection tool with the capabilities to search, detect, and alert. QRadar collects system event information from devices or applications on our network, including log information from operating systems, McAfee ePolicy Orchestrator, next-generation firewalls, and about 400 others by default. After QRadar collects the information, QRadar processes and stores the data collected. QRadar will normalize the collected information and analyze the data using a set of rules. We will be seeing QRadar in action in just a moment. McAfee ePolicy Orchestrator is a host-based security system, or HBSS. McAfee HBSS is used in many different environments to detect, prevent, and remove malicious files. McAfee HBSS has multiple point products, including McAfee Endpoint Protection, or ENS, McAfee Host Intrusion Prevention System, or HIPS, Policy Auditor, and many others. Today we'll be seeing an example of McAfee ENS finding malware, removing the malware, and how to respond to such an incident. Next-generation firewalls, or next-gen firewalls, are one of the first lines of defense on a network. Next-gen firewalls are able to filter network packets, do stateful inspection, conduct signature matching, packet payload inspection, and many others. Using firewalls, EPO, and QRadar alone, we can alert and respond to many different security threats. Our QRadar is deployed, our Windows systems, DNS, firewalls, and EPO are sending logs to QRadar. We have our McAfee agent with ENS installed and have begun triggering events. Before we start investigating an offense, let's go over the incident response process. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST for short, defines the incident response process in 4 steps: preparation, detection and analysis, containment, eradication, and recovery, and the last step is post-incident activity. The first step to incident response is preparation. Incident response preparation is the gathering of information required to respond to the incident. So one of the first things that you want to gather is a list of assets, ranking them by their importance to the organization as well as the risk if compromised. It's also important to gather a list of shareholders and individuals needed to contact when an attack occurs. This will prove beneficial during an incident, because at a time of crisis, you don't want to waste time looking for phone numbers or emails or even who to contact. And the last thing that you want to establish is what type of events will trigger an investigation. For example, would a standard user failing to log in multiple times at 8 a.m. trigger an offense? Probably not, since the typical start time for people in our office is 8 a.m. What if the same event occurred in the middle of the night? Yeah, multiple failed logins in the middle of the night may require an investigation, especially since people in our office don't typically work at night. Knowing what assets to monitor, which events to trigger an investigation, and who to contact will make the incident response process less stressful. The second step in incident response is detection and analysis. Incident response detection and analysis begins when an alert is received. The detection and analysis process begins with researching the events triggering the alert and gathering as much information related to the alert as possible. After the information is gathered, we will start analyzing the data gathered to determine the entry point, footprint, and validity of the alert. We would want to know, was it an authorized action by a new administrator, or was the attack using an administrator's account from a remote device? Is one device affected, or was it multiple devices? Once those kinds of questions are answered, we can begin the documentation and escalation process to notify all the parties that are involved and begin to document the incident itself, the time frame, the actions that were taken to mitigate and contain, eradicate, and recover. Step 3 of the incident response process is containment, eradication, and recovery. After the entry point is identified, we want to contain the threat to prevent further damage to our systems. Once the system is contained, we can work on removing the threat and then recovering any of the affected systems to restore business as usual. The last step of the incident response process is post-incident activity, or after-action reports. With business running as usual, the last step in the incident response should be completed. Reviewing the actions taken during the incident response process will provide the opportunity to learn from your deficiencies. After action reports can be kept to document the actions used to make the incident response more efficient. From my own experience, we've taken incident response from days to minutes. It definitely does help to document your mistakes and learn from them. Now that we have identified security threats, attack vectors, and the incident response process, as well as talked about some of the security tools used to detect, monitor, and prevent, we can begin to review some of the offenses that we have in our QRadar.
Welcome to Incident Response Demo Part 2, brought to you by IBM.
QRadar offenses are created when a rule is triggered and the action is set to create an offense. As you can see, we have 3 offenses listed in the QRadar interface now. This is the QRadar offense interface. Inside the QRadar offense interface, it lists out any offenses that the QRadar rules engine has alerted on. We have a few different ones here. The quickest way to determine priority is by the magnitude, and we can look at that by just placing our mouse over the bar graph. As you can see there, the first one's a magnitude 5, second's a magnitude 4, and these are all going to be the same. And then this last one's a magnitude 3. So let's go ahead and check out the magnitude 5. After we click into the offense, we're given a summary page. On the summary page, it gives us all kinds of different details, including the top 5 source IPs, the destination IPs, which log sources were involved in the event, as well as the categories of the events that were used to create the offense. One of the main things to look at on this page is the top 5 annotations. The very first one there is malicious URL detected. For this instance of QRadar, we actually have a rule that is built to compare DNS queries against a reference set, and that reference set has multiple malicious URLs in it. If we wanted to drive down further in this event, we can click on the events, and we can see the different events that were triggered. So it was the DNS in progress to the DNS server. And once QRadar seen that, it compared it to the reference set. It created its event and also created the offense. Alright, so now that we've seen the events that caused the offense, let's go ahead and search this DNS name out on X-Force Exchange and see if it is rated as malicious, which it should be since it is in our reference set, unless some things have happened and somebody else is now hosting that site or somebody else now owns it. Right away out here on X-Force Exchange, it's listed as a risk 10. This one does have a collection. I've already opened it up here, so we're just going to click over to it. And for this URL, it's used as part of a malware exfiltrating credentials via DNS attack. And one of the command and control servers for this is the Weber.co. That DNS does appear to be malicious. Let's jump back over to QRadar and see. So now that we've confirmed that it is a malicious DNS query, we want to jump into those events again and confirm that the query actually did happen. Right away I see that the destination IP is one that's not in our private network. So that tells me that that DNS address was resolved. And it resolves back to the 192.203.230.10 address. At this point, I would kick off the incident response process, beginning with step 2, since I've already prepared my asset list as well as my shareholders to contact and the events to trigger on. Alrighty, so I went ahead and pulled up my incident response form here. This is just a template, and to be honest, they all look different. Some of them actually are in Notepad. The first thing here is the type of incident. For the type of incident, we want to put DNS query to known botnet. The detection source was QRadar. The environment was the lab. The host name was labpc2. We need the IP address. In this case, it says multiple, but the reason it says multiple is because the workstation queried the DNS server, and then it queried the secondary DNS server. Then those DNS servers queried the outside world to resolve that DNS. So we want to pick the workstation IP as it's the one that's affected. And then it wants to know if it's a web server. So the system is a workstation. Then the public IP. Fortunately, our lab doesn't currently have a public IP. So for the public IP, I'll just make up one. Let's use Google's DNS server. The next step is to start writing down the time we find information and we complete part of the incident response process. So the next thing that we do is begin recording what time we found information. So the first thing that So the next thing that we do is begin recording what time we found information. So the first thing that we determined was that it was a malicious DNS query. Found out that it was this DNS. We'll go ahead and copy that in there and then continue on. So we found out the DNS query came from a workstation. So we can put workstation and then the IP of the workstation. We can put the host name in there if we know it as well. We identified the asset that is being malicious. We identified that it is a malicious URL. We identified that it did actually go out and make that request, and the request was successful. It was resolved. The next step would be to go ahead and disconnect it from the network. So to do that, we would want to submit a ticket and have them disconnect the workstation's switch port. Or if it's something that's physical, we can walk over and unplug it and then circle back with the network team to have them disable that port. So once we submit that ticket over to them, they disable it. Then we can go ahead and get started with the antivirus scan and closing up the incident if it doesn't need re-imaged. However, in this case, since it did reach out to a botnet, even if the AV scan comes back as clean, I still think it's a good idea to go ahead and re-image it. But one of the reasons that we'd want to conduct the AV scan begin with is to determine if something else is already on there. Maybe OAS isn't actually detecting the virus, and it just needs a full scan to be detected. Once the switchboard's disabled, we would go over and kick off our AV scan. So once we have our ENS scan kicked off, we want to go back and we want to tidy up this document. Just going to pretend like that AV scan come back. It was clean. After that, I would go ahead and make the call to reimage the device, since it is a known botnet and control network. So we don't want any chances of that being part of our local network. We don't want it to infect other hosts or become part of that botnet itself. And since it is just a workstation, it's not anything super critical. It can be reset, reimaged pretty quickly, and no harm done. And after that, I would send this information up and allow them to process it and archive it. So we have it, we know what had happened on this day. Once we're completed our investigation, we want to go ahead and close the incident. We can go ahead and select a response, and we can paste our incident response form in there and close the ticket, close that offense out. Once it's closed, it will no longer show up in our active offenses, and then we can move on to the next offense. So since these all three are the same magnitude, we definitely want to check out the older one in case it needs a faster response. Went ahead and clicked on the offense. On the summary tab again, we can see the offense source is this IP address, which is a workstation as well. It's actually the same workstation as the last offense. And we can also see that the log sources that were part of the offense was QRadar as well as the firewall. And we can see that the events that were used to create this offense were session open and session closed events. And in the annotations, it says that it's a possible DDoS attack. So we definitely want to check this one out. We'll go into events. And since this is a local to local attack, it's a little less relevant. Typically, when you see local to a local DDoS attacks, it's just a user that's doing his daily job. For instance, this user is actually working with this server to develop an application using an API, so it's expected to see multiple 443 session open, session closes to that system from that workstation. So therefore, this incident would be a false positive. A false positive is triggered even though the events are typical, they're normal traffic. It might just be something that's beginning to happen, or maybe it's a new server that stood up, and the rules just aren't in here yet. The rules haven't been modified. In that case, we would want to go ahead and just tune QRadar. That being said, we can go ahead and we can go ahead and close the offense, and we're going to close it as a non-issue and not a false positive, just because we want that rule to stay in QRadar. Once we modify the rule, we want to come in and make a comment to say that the threshold was increased, if that's how you modified that rule to lessen the amount of false positives you get. I'm going to click OK, close that offense out.
Welcome to Incident Response Demo, Part 3, brought to you by IBM.
Since this offense here is older, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at it. It also has a pretty high severity, even though the credibility is low. So the first thing I notice here is the event name, file infected, no cleaner available, OES has denied access to the command. On the summary page, as you can see here, the file was infected and there's no cleaner available. Definitely want to check the events. And it looks like a virus was detected on this machine. We got the source IP. And then we can also find the file name in here. So we found the file, and it looks like it's actually triggering on a file that's in the recycle bin. Went ahead and copied that out because fairly certain we're going to go ahead and start our incident response. Just going to write down the time, keep some detailed notes. And once I've identified the system, I've identified the file, I'm going to go ahead and contact the network team again, get that switch port disabled. Once I submitted that ticket to the network team to have the port disabled, I'm going to go ahead and look back on my list of individuals to contact that we created in step 1 of incident response, where we prepared the shareholders list in the event of an attack. Once I contact them, I'm going to go ahead over and kick off my AV scan and wait for the results. So once I've kicked off my AV scan, I'm going to go ahead and fill out the rest of the incident response form, add any more notes in here that I have. So once I've completed the AV scan, I come back, the file wasn't removed, it's still there. It also detected, a few other files. I'm going to go ahead and recommend that this system be reimaged as well. So we send that out to our IAM, and he comes back, he tells us, you're good to go. Go ahead and reimage it. At that point in time, we want to go ahead and do our after action report. And an after action report can be just a running notepad document that keep a list of mistakes or efficiencies that happened during the incident response. The first incident that we completed for the DNS query, I looked at the events, and then I went and looked at the DNS query to see if it was malicious, and then I had to go back to the events to see if it was actually successful. So something I could have done to improve my efficiency is when I looked at the events, I could have ensured that it was successful before I even looked it up. If the DNS would have been blocked by our DNS server, then I wouldn't have wasted the time to go out and look up that IP. Another thing that I didn't do in the first one was I didn't alert any of my shareholders. I didn't tell anyone that I was going through the incident response. And then in the second one, which was for the DOS attack, there was a lot of events there. I didn't look to see if there was maybe multiple source addresses, or maybe it wasn't even the developers that were logged in. Maybe it was somebody else. So I didn't do a full investigation there, and it's definitely something that might have wanted to look a little further into. With the after action review, it's for you to learn. It's important to do because it can improve your response time drastically. Just to walk through the incident response process one more time and make sure I hit on the important details. Step one is preparation. You want to know what you're looking for, know what assets you're monitoring, kind of events that you're going to trigger on and start down that incident response path, as well as the people to contact in the case of an incident. Step two of incident response is detection and analysis. Incident response detection and analysis begins with getting the alert and then beginning to gather information and research the events that had triggered the alert and determining if it is a real event or if it's a false positive, as well as determining how large is this incident. Step three of incident response is containment, eradication, and recovery. For the first one, the containment portion is to disconnect it from the network. If it's a workstation, it's easy to walk over and pull the cable out of the wall. If it's something like a server or a VM, you have to contact that team that's responsible for those network connections. And the two incidents that we wrote up the report for, we did disable it using the network team. Typically, that's the quickest way. You don't know where that workstation is, or it's across the building or something. And then after you contain it, you want to eradicate it. Make sure you look for other threats. Make sure that file's not been placed on the share and it's being copied all over the place now. Make sure that system's not communicating with other systems more than it normally does, or on a different port than it normally does. And then the last step is recovery. So you want to get the system back to end state. Typically, approval has to be given from the manager to allow that system back on the network, or give direction to say it needs re-imaged. In our case, both of the incidents needed the system re-imaged. And last but not least, the post-incident activity part of incident response is step 4. So in the after-action report, like I mentioned earlier, just want to add any mistakes in there, anything that you could do better, anything that will make your incident response time more efficient. Thanks for watching.